Coulter Draven figured he was the king of Wyoming, and he despised the idea of marrying Malin Dross. His parents had suggested it, pushed it, really. To him, it was more than a bad idea. It was an insult, a slap in the face. Marry her? A woman short, plain, and a decade older than any bride he'd ever pictured on his arm. He scoffed just thinking about it. A man like him, strong, sought after, the biggest catch in 3 counties, shackled to someone so ordinary, so forgettable. The world was overflowing with beautiful, sweet young women who would kill for a glance from him, and his parents wanted him to settle for a dusty spinster. But what Coulter Draven didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that a young buck might see the top of the tree, but the old-timer on the porch has already seen the lightning strike it. And a storm was coming for him. The thunder of 300 longhorn cattle was the first sign. It was a September night in 1883, and their hooves pounded the Wyoming earth like war drums rolling through Devil's Canyon. Coulter was checking the north fence line, just a routine ride. Then a mountain lion screamed. It was a sound that split the darkness and tore a hole in the world. It sent the entire herd into a blind, stampeding panic, a panic that would change his life forever. His horse, a steady bay named Thunder, never saw the prairie dog hole. One moment they were racing ahead of the surge, the next the ground gave way. Thunder went down with a sickening crack. Coulter was thrown forward, the world tumbling into a dizzying vortex of dust and terror. Hooves, hundreds of them, thundered past his head, close enough to feel the wind from their passing. Then came the impact. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded through his left leg. It shot through his ribs, his shoulder, a symphony of shattering bone. And then, just as quickly, the world went black. Darkness swallowed him whole. When the sun rose over the Draven ranch, it was a grisly sight. They found him crumpled near the broken fence, a broken man tangled with a broken horse. He was barely breathing. His foreman, old Jake Murphy, took one look at Coulter's twisted leg and ghost-white face and knew. They had minutes, not hours. "Nearest doctor's in Cheyenne," Jake muttered, chewing his tobacco so hard his jaw ached. 2 days hard ride. He won't make it. "What about that nurse woman?" young Tommy Conincade suggested, his voice tight with fear. "The one in Cedar Ridge. Heard she's got healing hands." Jake spat a brown stream of juice into the dust. The name tasted like ash in his mouth. "Malin Dross. She's good with a fever or a cough, but she ain't no real doctor. Not for this." "She's 8 miles away, not 80, Tommy shot back, his fear making him bold. "You want to be the one to tell Hoyt and Sarah their boy died while we sat here debating credentials?" That settled it. There was no more debate. They loaded Coulter onto a makeshift stretcher, a door pulled from a line shack, and rode like the devil was chasing them. They rode hard for Cedar Ridge. They rode for the small, converted cabin where Miss Malin Dross ran her clinic. At 38, Malin had never married, never had children, and never seemed to want either. The townsfolk whispered about her. Too particular, they said. Too set in her ways. Too plain to catch a man's eye. But when death came knocking at your door, nobody whispered about Malin Dross. They prayed she'd answer the call, and Coulter Draven's life now depended on that prayer being answered. 2 days later, Hoyt and Sarah Draven arrived. Their hearts hammered against their ribs with every clop of their horses' hooves. They rode into Cedar Ridge expecting the worst. They imagined their son, their proud, strong Coulter, lying in some filthy frontier hovel, neglected and dying, wasting away under the care of some backwoods spinster. They reined in their horses in front of her cabin and stopped dead. Their mouths fell open. The place wasn't a hovel, it was a sanctuary. The clinic sparkled like a church on Sunday morning. White muslin curtains, so clean they seemed to glow, fluttered at spotless windows. The wooden floors gleamed with a fresh coat of wax, shining like polished amber. And the smell. It wasn't the smell of sickness and death they'd braced for. It smelled of carbolic soap, of absolute sterility, and something else, something warm and comforting that made their empty stomachs growl. Fresh bread, maybe, or apple pie. But it was their son who delivered the final, staggering shock. Coulter lay propped against a mountain of clean white pillows. His face was shaved smooth, the dark stubble of his ordeal gone. His hair was combed neat, no longer matted with blood and dirt, and his shattered leg, was splinted with a professional precision that would make a city doctor proud. It was wrapped in bandages so brilliantly white they almost hurt the eyes. A bowl of what looked like rich chicken broth sat steaming on a bedside table that had been polished to a mirror brightness. Standing beside the bed, watching over him, was the plainest woman Sarah Draven had ever seen, and somehow the most remarkable. Malin Dross stood barely 5 feet tall. Her mouse-brown hair was pulled back into a severe, no-nonsense bun. She had a face that wouldn't stop a clock, but it certainly wouldn't start one either. She wore a spotless gray dress with an apron that, impossibly, remained unstained despite the clear evidence of her hard work. In her hand, she clutched a small folded white napkin. It was one of many, Sarah would soon learn, that she carried everywhere. "Mr. and Mrs. Draven," Malin said. Her voice was quiet, but it was as sure and steady as bedrock. "Your son's leg was badly broken, a compound fracture of the tibia, but the bones set clean. He has 3 cracked ribs, but they're healing. He lost a considerable amount of blood, but he's young and strong. He'll walk again." She paused, her gaze direct and unflinching. "Though he'll carry a limp." Hoyt stared at his son. Coulter looked better than he had in months, even before the accident. He looked cared for. Truly cared for. "Miss Dross," Hoyt said, his voice thick with unshed tears of relief. "How can we ever repay you?" Malin dabbed at her nose with the little white napkin. It was a nervous habit, they'd come to learn, a small gesture that betrayed the calm confidence of her voice. "Payments $5 for the setting, 3 for the boarding, 50 cents a day for meals and medicine." She glanced at Coulter, and for a fleeting moment, something that might have been fondness softened her plain features. "But your son's been no trouble at all." Sarah watched her. She watched how gently Malin adjusted Coulter's pillow, her movements efficient yet tender. She watched how she checked his temperature with a practiced hand, her touch light and professional. She watched how she made sure his water glass stayed full, anticipating his needs before he even knew them himself. And in that moment, a wild, audacious idea bloomed in Sarah's mind, like a desert flower after a hard rain. An idea that could solve everything. "Miss Dross," Sarah said, choosing her words as carefully as a person crossing a frozen river. "Would you consider, that is, might you be willing to continue caring for Coulter at our ranch, as a live-in nurse, until he's fully recovered?" Hoyt caught his wife's eye. He saw the brilliant, crazy plan taking shape there, and he nodded slowly. The exact same thought had struck him. Here was a woman, not just any woman, a woman who could care for their son with unmatched skill, a woman who could clearly run a household with the precision of a drill sergeant. And maybe, just maybe, the daughter-in-law they had long prayed for. Malin's face flushed a delicate shade of pink. It was the first sign of fluster they had seen from her. "Well, I suppose I could manage that. For the right compensation, of course." $20 a month, plus room and board, Hoyt offered instantly, not wanting to let the opportunity slip away. "And we'll discuss other arrangements as time goes on." The deal was struck, but they had forgotten one crucial detail. They hadn't asked the patient. When they broached the subject with Coulter later that evening, his reaction was swift and brutal. "Marry her?" He nearly choked on his chicken broth. The words exploded out of him, full of disbelief and outrage. "Ma? Pa? Have you completely lost your minds?" He glared at them, his eyes blazing with wounded pride. "She's older than dirt. She's shorter than a fence post, and about as pretty as a mud fence after a week of rain. I'm 28 years old, for crying out loud. I could have any girl in 3 counties. Any girl except the one who'd care for you like she has," Sarah said, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't need caring for." Coulter snapped, though his voice cracked with exhaustion and pain, betraying the lie. "I need a wife who will turn heads when she walks into a room, who will give me sons that other men envy, not some dried-up spinster who smells like carbolic soap." Hoyt's jaw tightened into a hard line. "Son, you're talking about the woman who saved your life." "And I'm grateful," Coulter shot back through gritted teeth. "But gratitude ain't love, and it sure as hell ain't reason enough to marry someone so ordinary." The humiliation burned in Coulter's chest like acid. Here he was, Coulter Draven, the catch of the territory, being pushed, cornered, practically sold to a woman who belonged in someone else's kitchen. Not in his life, not in his marriage bed. The very idea made his pride writhe like a snake. Yet, the next morning, as Malin packed her medical bag and prepared to accompany them back to the Draven ranch, Coulter couldn't deny the small, traitorous flutter of something in his chest. Relief, maybe, or curiosity, or perhaps just the lingering effects of the morphine she'd been giving him for the pain. Whatever it was, he pushed it down deep. He buried it under thick layers of wounded pride and stubborn prejudice. He had no way of knowing what was happening. He couldn't see that sometimes the best recipes take the longest to cook, and the sweetest poison always comes in the plainest bottle. The Draven Ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of prime Wyoming grassland. The main house was large and imposing, but it had seen better days, and far, far worse housekeeping. When Malin Dross stepped through the front door that cool October morning, she surveyed the scene not like a guest, but like a general planning a military campaign. The enemy was filth, and it was everywhere. Dust coated every surface like a layer of gray snow. It puffed up in little clouds with every footstep. Dirty plates were stacked precariously in the sink, crusted with the fossilized remains of countless bachelor meals. The wooden floors, which had once been beautiful, were scarred with boot marks and stained with things she didn't want to identify. Cobwebs, thick and ancient, draped the corners of every room like funeral shrouds, and the whole place smelled. It was a thick, cloying miasma of old tobacco, sweat-stained leather, and pure, unadulterated neglect. "Well?" Malin murmured, pulling out one of her ever-present white napkins to dab at her nose. She didn't sound disgusted. She sounded determined. "We'll have this sorted soon enough." Her campaign began immediately. She settled Coulter into the main bedroom, the one he'd inherited from his parents. She propped his injured leg on a stack of fresh pillows she'd had the foresight to bring from town. Within an hour, she had stripped his bed of its grimy linens, boiled them in a great pot over the fire, and remade it with sheets so crisp and white they crackled when he moved. She threw open every window in the house, letting the sharp prairie wind surge through the stale rooms, chasing out months of stagnant air like a ghost. "What in God's name are you doing?" Coulter demanded from his bed as she began dusting the furniture with a ruthless, military precision. "Cleaning," she replied without looking up from her work. Her voice was flat and matter-of-fact. "Dirt breeds infection. Infection kills. I will not have my patient dying of something so easily preventable." "I'm not asking you to clean the whole damn house," he grumbled, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and resentment. "No," she agreed, her rag moving in swift, efficient circles. "You're not asking. I'm doing it anyway." And she did. Over the following days, Malin transformed the Draven house like a prairie fire transforms grassland. It was a complete and merciless transformation. She scrubbed the floors on her hands and knees, using a harsh lye soap that stripped away years of grime until they gleamed with the warmth of the wood beneath. She washed every curtain, beat every rug until clouds of dust billowed from them, and polished every piece of furniture until it reflected the light like dark water. The ranch hands, used to the house's comfortable squalor, whispered among themselves, utterly amazed by her relentless energy. She rose before the sun and worked until well after it had set, never seeming to tire, never slowing her pace. Young Tommy Conincade, watching her scrub the entire vast kitchen floor without once stopping for rest, dubbed her horse stamina Malin. "She's like one of them newfangled steam engines," he told the others over supper one night. "Just keeps chugging along, never ever runs out of power." But Malin did more than just clean. She mended. She took Coulter's torn shirts and repaired them with stitches so tiny and perfect they were nearly invisible. She resewed buttons on coats, oiled leather saddles until they looked new again, and polished his boots to a mirror brightness he hadn't seen since the day he bought them. She organized the kitchen with a startling mathematical precision. Flour, sugar, and salt were stored in identical labeled tins. Spices were arranged alphabetically. Pots and pans were grouped by function and frequency of use. The transformation wasn't lost on Coulter, though he resented it deeply. He felt like an intruder in his own home. His house had gone from feeling like a comfortable, familiar wreck to feeling like a military barracks. Or a hospital. Everything had its place, and everything was in its place. The clean, sharp scent of soap and starch had replaced the familiar bachelor smell of leather and smoke. "You don't need to do all this," he told her one afternoon. He was sitting on the porch watching her sweep it for what he was sure was the second time that day. "No," she agreed, her sweeping never pausing. "I don't need to. I choose to." "Why?" The question burst out of him, sharper than he intended. She stopped sweeping. She turned and looked at him with those plain brown eyes that somehow seemed to see right through his bluster, right down to the bone. "Because a house should be a home, not a hovel," she said simply. "Because cleanliness prevents disease. Because a man deserves better than to live like an animal in a barn." The words struck a nerve. He had been living like that. Like a man who expected to stay a bachelor forever, with no thought for comfort or pride in his surroundings. Seeing his house through her eyes, he felt a hot, unfamiliar wave of shame. And that shame curdled instantly into resentment. Resentment made him cruel. "I suppose you think all this scrubbing and polishing makes you indispensable," he sneered, his voice as sharp as broken glass. Malin's small hand tightened on the broom handle, her knuckles whitening. But when she spoke, her voice remained perfectly steady. "I think it makes me useful. Nothing more, nothing less. My future wife won't need to scrub floors. I'll hire help for that." "Your future wife will be lucky to have floors worth scrubbing," Malin replied quietly. And with that, she went back to her sweeping, leaving him to stew in his own meanness. The exchange left Coulter feeling hollow and small, but he was far too proud to apologize. Instead, he just watched her. He watched her work with a growing, grudging confusion. She never complained. She never asked for praise. She never seemed to expect a single word of gratitude. She just worked, as steady and sure as the sunrise, transforming his world one small, relentless improvement at a time. It was during his second week of recovery that she offered her first piece of unsolicited financial wisdom. He'd been laid up, reviewing the ranch ledgers and complaining loudly about the constant cost of repairing his main plow. It seemed to break down every few months, costing him time and money. "Better to buy one strong plow than to mend 3 cracked ones," she said, her hands busy changing the bandages on his leg. Her touch was firm and professional. "Spend once, not thrice." Coulter bristled at the advice. It was sound, and that made it even more irritating. "I didn't ask for your opinion on my farming practices, Miss Dross." "No," she agreed, securing the new bandage with practiced efficiency. "You didn't ask, but you got it anyway. free of charge. Her logic was a burr under his saddle. It gnawed at him for the rest of the day. He did the math. He'd spent more money over the past 2 years patching up that old, worthless plow than a brand new one would have cost him outright. The realization stung his pride like a hornet. How had this plain, quiet spinster seen what he, a successful rancher, had missed completely? But as the days turned into a week, and then another, as his house grew brighter, cleaner, and more comfortable than it had ever been, Coulter began to understand something that disturbed him deeply. Malin Dross wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't trying to win his affection or trap him into marriage. She was simply being herself, competent, thorough, and utterly without pretense. And despite every effort to maintain his disdain, despite his wounded pride and his stubborn, ingrained prejudices, he found himself looking forward to her quiet presence in his home. The knowledge sat in his stomach like undigested food, uncomfortable, unsettling, impossible to ignore. The worst part was the growing, terrifying suspicion that his parents might not have been entirely wrong about her worth. But admitting that would mean admitting he'd been a fool, and Coulter Draven's pride wouldn't allow such a humiliation. Not yet, anyway. October mornings on the Wyoming prairie carried a bite, a sharp, clear cold that cut through blankets and settled deep into your bones. For Coulter, those mornings had become a strange kind of sweet torment, a feeling he couldn't explain and didn't want to examine too closely. Each dawn, Mylin would enter his room. She moved like a shadow in the pre-dawn light, carrying a basin of warm water, a bar of soap, and a stack of clean, soft towels. Her movements were efficient, professional, almost clinical. She was there to help him wash. It was an intimacy born of pure medical necessity, but it left him burning with a confusing mix of embarrassment and something else, something far more dangerous. "Arms up," she'd say simply, her voice low and calm. And he'd comply, his muscles tensing as he tried to ignore the feel of her small, competent hands moving over his chest and shoulders. She washed him like a mother might wash a child, without a hint of self-consciousness or shame. But Coulter was not a child, and his body's response to her touch was anything but patient. The morning that changed everything started like all the others. A cold October rain drummed a steady rhythm against the window panes. Malin entered with her basin and towels. The humid air had caused a few strands of her mouse-brown hair to escape their severe bun, softening the lines of her face. "Morning," she said briskly, setting her supplies on the bedside table. "How's the pain today?" "Manageable," Coulter replied, though his voice came out rougher, thicker than he intended. The truth was, his physical pain had been manageable for days. It was a different kind of discomfort that kept him awake at night, an ache that had nothing to do with broken bones. It had him staring at the ceiling, thinking thoughts that made him feel like a green schoolboy. She helped him sit up. She reached to help him remove his nightshirt. As she drew the fabric over his head, her fingers brushed lightly against his chest. It was nothing, a fleeting, accidental touch. But his body responded with a sudden, undeniable urgency that made him gasp. The evidence of his arousal was stark, impossible to hide, impossible to explain away as anything other than exactly what it was. A hot, mortifying blush crept up his neck. Malin glanced down just for a second. Then her eyes flicked up to meet his face. Her own cheeks colored a faint pink. Coulter braced himself for a horrified retreat, for stammering, for disgust. But instead, she simply reached for her ever-present white napkin and dabbed at her nose. That nervous little habit he'd grown to recognize. And then she spoke. "Best keep your weapon holstered, sir," she said quietly. And in her voice, there was a hint of something he never would have expected. Amusement. The words, the tone, the gentle humor. It struck him like a bolt of lightning. Here was this plain, practical, proper woman, faced with his most primal, embarrassing moment. and she met it not with shock, but with a quiet, teasing wit. Something inside his chest, something hard and brittle he'd been protecting for years, cracked wide open. A flood of feeling he wasn't prepared for rushed in, and he laughed. He actually threw his head back and laughed. A real, deep laugh at the absolute absurdity of it all. "This confirms it," he said, his voice thick with a dozen emotions he couldn't begin to name. "You're a sweet poison, Malin Dross. I can't seem to get enough of you. Everyone in this territory speaks so highly of you, and now I see why. Sometimes I wonder if you're too good to be true." The words hung in the quiet, rain-scented air between them, like smoke from a doused campfire. Impossible to take back. Too honest to deny. Malin's hands, which had been holding the washcloth, stilled. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the drumming of the rain. "Sweet poison," she repeated softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Is that what I am to you?" "I don't know what you are to me," Coulter admitted, the truth spilling out of him before he could stop it. "I only know that you've turned my entire world upside down, and I can't decide whether I want to thank you for it or run for the hills." Something shifted in her plain brown eyes. A softening, a flicker of recognition of the raw truth he'd just spoken. When she resumed washing him, her touch was different. It was gentler, more lingering, less clinical. And when she leaned close to tend to a stubborn patch of dirt on his shoulder, he caught the scent of her. Not carbolic soap and starch this time, but something indefinably feminine, something warm and clean that made his head spin. "Malin," he whispered, his voice hoarse. She looked up at him, and in that moment, her plain brown eyes were the most beautiful eyes in the world. The kiss happened without planning, without thought. It was a sudden, inevitable closing of the distance between them, a moment of connection that tasted of morning coffee and rain and 1,000 unspoken possibilities. Her lips were soft and warm and hesitant at first, but when she didn't pull away, he deepened the kiss, pouring all his confusion and frustration and growing, terrifying affection into that one point of contact. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Malin's cheeks were flushed a deep rose. Her hair was more disheveled than he'd ever seen it, and she looked young and beautiful and utterly, completely desirable. "This is complicated," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Everything worthwhile is complicated," he replied, surprised by his own sudden wisdom. From that morning forward, everything was different. The unspoken rules that had governed their strange relationship were shattered. There were more stolen kisses in the quiet moments of the day, more lingering touches that sent jolts of electricity through them both, more moments when they forgot the practical professional boundaries of nurse and patient. But it was more than just physical intimacy. It was a growing trust, a new kind of partnership. She began to offer counsel along with her medical care. She saw the worries that plagued him, the burdens of running a ranch this size. When he complained about the mountain of ranch work piling up while he recovered, she didn't offer sympathy. She offered strategy. She listened thoughtfully, her head tilted to one side before responding. "Let the hands take the strain," she advised. "A man's strength is a finite resource. It's wasted when he tries to plow every furrow himself. More trusted hands means more work gets done, which means more money and more time saved for the work only you can do." Again, her practical, unassailable wisdom stung his pride. He'd always prided himself on being a hands-on boss, on doing everything himself to ensure it was done right. He saw delegation as weakness. But as he was forced to watch his ranch operations from his sickbed, he began to see the clear, sharp truth in her words. "You think I should hire more men?" he asked, testing her. "I think you should trust the men you already have," she corrected gently. "Tommy Connecade has a good head for cattle. Let him manage the herds. Jake Murphy knows horses better than he knows his own children. Let him run the stables. Let them do what they do best, and you focus your energy on what only you can do. Making the big decisions, planning for the future, building something that will last. A week later, he put her advice to the test. He called his foreman and his senior ranch hands to the house for a meeting. For the first time in his life, he didn't bark orders. He didn't micromanage every single detail. He listened. He asked for their ideas. He delegated responsibilities, giving them authority he had always hoarded for himself. And he was stunned by the result. The energy and loyalty that came flooding back at him was palpable. His men, trusted and respected, worked with a new vigor and intelligence. "How did you know?" he asked her that evening as she changed his bandages for the last time. "Know what? That men respond better to trust than to orders?" She smiled. It was the first genuine, unguarded smile he'd ever seen from her, and it transformed her plain face into something radiant. It lit her up from the inside. "Because everyone responds better to trust than to orders," she said simply. She gave his bandage a final, gentle pat. Even stubborn, prideful ranchers recovering from stampede injuries. The barb hit its mark, but this time he didn't feel anger. He felt a deep, swelling admiration. This woman, this quiet, plain, extraordinary woman, saw right through his bluster and his pride to the man underneath. And she saw something there worth believing in. For the first time in his life, Coulter began to seriously wonder if maybe, just maybe, his parents had been wiser than he'd ever given them credit for. But admitting that meant admitting he'd been wrong about everything, and his stubborn pride wasn't ready to surrender completely. Not yet. There were still battles to be fought, both with the world and with the man in the mirror, before he could fully embrace the sweet poison that Malin Dross had become. November winds howled across the Draven Ranch like banshees, carrying the first sharp promise of winter and the clean, cold scent of snow. Coulter's leg had healed. He could now move around the house, around the entire ranch, with only the aid of a cane. His restless energy, so long confined, began to chafe against the last vestiges of his recovery. He started spending his afternoons on the covered porch, a vantage point from which he could watch his men work, and from which he could shout orders that carried on the sharp, cold air. Malin watched him from the kitchen window as she kneaded bread dough for their noon meal. Her lips were pressed into a thin, tight line of disapproval. She'd grown to know Coulter's moods like a barometer knows the weather. She could see the storm building inside him. She saw it in the white-knuckled way he gripped his cane, in the sharp, impatient edge to his voice when he called out to the hands. "Tommy!" Coulter barked at the young cowboy, his voice cracking like a whip. "Get those cattle moved to the south pasture before they eat that grass down to nothing. Are you blind?" "Yes, sir, Mr. Draven," Tommy replied, his face tight. But Malin, from her window, caught the flash of resentment in the young man's eyes. He'd been moving those cattle all morning, carefully and thoroughly. Coulter's tone implied he was lazy, not methodical. "Jake, what in blazes are you doing with that horse?" "I said shoe him, not coddle him. We're burning daylight." Old Jake Murphy, who had been shoeing horses since before Coulter was born, didn't even look up. He simply nodded and continued his work, but his jaw was tight with 1,000 unspoken words. By late afternoon, the tension on the ranch was as thick and suffocating as smoke. The hands moved with the careful, resentful precision of men trying not to give offense. Their usual easy chatter and laughter had died away, replaced by curt whispers and sullen silence. Malin had seen enough. The ranch was suffering from its master's ill temper. She found Coulter on the porch that evening, still gripping his cane, staring out at the darkening range with frustrated, angry eyes. "Supper's ready," she said quietly, settling into the rocking chair beside him. "In a minute," he snapped. His voice carried the same harsh, grating edge he'd been using on his men all day. Malin pulled out one of her little white napkins and began folding and unfolding it. A gesture he'd learned meant she was choosing her words with extreme care. "Coulter," she said finally, her voice soft but clear, "can I ask you something?" "What? Do you think your men are lazy?" The question caught him completely off guard. "What? No, of course not. They're good hands, best in the territory. Do you think they're stupid?" "No." His voice carried the first faint hint of uncertainty. He was beginning to see where this was going. "Do you think they don't care about this ranch as much as you do?" "Of course they don't. It's not their ranch." "Then why?" she asked, her voice still quiet, still reasonable. "Do you speak to them as if they are lazy, stupid, and don't care at all?" He had no answer. The truth of her words hit him squarely in the chest, knocking the wind out of his righteous anger. He'd been a tyrant, a frustrated, impatient bully. "Talking is softer than shouting, but it carries further," she continued, seeing his silence for what it was. "Your men worked twice as hard today as they have in weeks. Not because of your orders, but in spite of them. They were working to prove you wrong." A small, sad smile played at the corners of her mouth. She returned to kneading her bread dough, her movements rhythmic and calming. "Men aren't so different from horses, Coulter. They respond better to a steady hand on the reins than a heavy whip on their backs." He watched her work, marveling again at the simple, profound wisdom that seemed to emanate from her. "Where did you learn all this?" "My father was a blacksmith," she replied, her gaze distant for a moment. "He taught me that the strongest iron isn't made by beating it into submission. It's forged with patient, steady work, with just the right amount of heat and just the right amount of pressure." Coulter looked at her strong, capable hands, at the patience in her movements. This woman was an endless series of surprises, a puzzle box that revealed a more complex, more beautiful pattern with every layer he uncovered. "Malin," he said quietly, the word full of a humility he hadn't felt in years, "I owe you an apology." She paused in her kneading, looking up at him, her brown eyes searching his. "For what?" "For thinking you were just a nurse, for thinking you were ordinary, for not seeing—" He struggled, trying to find the right words to express the monumental shift that had occurred inside him. "For not seeing how much you had to teach me." A faint blush colored her cheeks, and she dabbed at her nose with the back of her floured hand. "I'm still just a nurse, Coulter, and I'm still ordinary." "No," he said firmly. He stood up, the cane forgotten, and moved closer to her, into the warm, fragrant air of the kitchen. "You're not. You're extraordinary, and I'm beginning to think I'm the luckiest man in all of Wyoming to have you in my house." The bread dough lay forgotten on the board as she turned to face him fully. "Coulter," she began, a warning in her tone. "I know," he said, his voice dropping, becoming more intimate. He reached up and gently tucked an escaped strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered on her skin. "I know I'm not ready to say everything I'm thinking, and I know you deserve better than half-formed feelings from a stubborn, prideful fool. But I want you to know, I need you to know, that you're changing me, Malin. For the better." She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for just a fraction of a second, a silent surrender. "Change isn't always easy," she whispered. "Nothing worthwhile ever is," he replied, and he leaned down and kissed her forehead gently. "But I'm beginning to think it might just be worth it." As the first snows of winter began to fall, blanketing the ranch in a pristine, silent white, Coulter found himself looking forward to each day with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just because of the growing intimacy between him and Malin, the stolen moments that had become the center of his world. It was because each day with her brought new lessons, new insights, new reasons to respect the woman who had so quietly and completely revolutionized his life. But he also knew, with a knot of dread in his stomach, that the greatest tests were still ahead. The town was already whispering. He'd heard the murmurs on his last trip for supplies, the spinster nurse living in the handsome bachelor's house. Soon those whispers would grow louder. They would become accusations, they would demand answers, and Coulter would have to decide, once and for all, whether his growing feelings for Malin were strong enough to withstand the harsh, cruel judgment of the world. The sweet poison was working its way deeper and deeper into his system, and he was beginning to wonder if he even wanted an antidote at all. December came to Wyoming with the fury of a wounded bear. Blizzards raged for days on end, piling snow high against the windows and doors. Winds howled from the north, rattling the house like dice in a cup. Coulter had been walking without his cane for 2 weeks now. His leg was strong, the limp barely noticeable. But he found reasons to stay close to the house, reasons that all had the same name and the same gentle brown eyes. The brutal weather had forced him into town only twice that month, both times for essential supplies that couldn't wait for the spring thaw. It was on the second trip that it happened. He was standing outside Kellerman's general store, stamping the snow from his boots, while Jake loaded sacks of feed into the wagon, and he overheard the conversation, a conversation that would ignite the powder keg of his still fragile pride. "It's shameful, if you ask me," came the sharp carrying voice of Lorena Veilhart, the banker's wife and the self-appointed keeper of moral standards in Cedar Ridge. A woman her age, living in sin with a man young enough to be her, well, nearly her son. "Now, Lorena, she's not that old," protested Tressie Cade, young Tommy's mother, "and she did save the boy's life after all." "Saving his life is one thing," Lorena continued, her voice dripping with the authority of absolute certainty. "But living under his roof, unmarried, unchaperoned, it's a scandal is what it is. And what on earth could a man like Coulter Draven possibly see in such a plain, mousy little creature?" Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial hiss, but Coulter heard every venomous word. "She's too old to give him children, that's for certain. She's too short to look proper on his arm at a dance. And she's far too common to raise his standing in society. He's ruining himself for her." Iona Blackidge, the rail-thin schoolteacher, joined the verbal slaughter with the eager malice of someone who rarely had such juicy gossip to share. "I heard from my cousin in Cheyenne," she chirped, "that Coulter was practically engaged to Judge Morrison's daughter before the accident. A beautiful girl, barely 20, with a dowry that would set a man up for life. Now look at him, throwing it all away for a spinster nurse who'll be in her grave before he's even reached his prime." The words hit Coulter like a series of physical blows. Each one landed squarely on the tender, insecure parts of him that still questioned his feelings for Malin. The parts that still cared what the world thought. He wanted to storm over to that circle of gossiping hens and defend her honor, to shout them down. But the cruel, insidious voice of his own deep-seated doubts whispered that they were only saying what half the territory was thinking. He rode home in a cold, rigid silence. Jake Murphy, sitting beside him on the wagon seat, kept stealing worried glances at his employer's granite profile. The old cowboy had seen that look before. It usually appeared right before someone got fired or a fistfight broke out. That evening, the poison from the town's words seeped into his own thoughts. As Malin prepared their supper with her usual quiet efficiency, Coulter found himself watching her with new eyes tainted by harsh judgment. She was shorter than he'd ever really noticed. Her figure was unremarkable beneath the practical gray dress. Her hair, escaping its bun in the kitchen's heat, did look a bit mouse brown and lifeless in the lamplight. When had he started thinking she was beautiful? Had he been fooling himself? "You're quiet tonight," Malin observed, glancing up from the stove where she was stirring a pot of stew that smelled, as always, like heaven. "Just thinking," he replied, his voice curt and cold. She studied his face with those perceptive eyes. the ones that always seemed to see straight through to his soul. Bad thoughts, by the look of it. Nothing that concerns you. The words came out harsher than he'd intended. He saw her flinch, just a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, before she turned back to her cooking. The sight of her hurt filled him with a sharp, immediate self-loathing, which only made his mood darker and more volatile. After supper, she began to prepare his evening medications. It was a ritual they had maintained even though he no longer needed them. It was their quiet time together. But tonight, Coulter couldn't contain the poison that had been building in his system all day. "You don't need to do that anymore," he said abruptly, as she approached with the small bottle of liniment she used to massage the lingering ache from his leg. "The muscle still gets tight in this cold weather," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. "It will help you sleep." "I said I don't need it." The words came out like a whip crack in the quiet room. Malin stopped dead. She stood there, the little bottle clutched in her small hands. "Of course," she said quietly, her face a pale, unreadable mask. I'll clean up the kitchen then." But as she turned to walk away, his frustration and self-hatred finally boiled over. "Wait," he snapped. She froze, her back to him. "I heard them today," he said, the words ugly and thick in his mouth. "In town. Talking about you. About us." She turned around slowly. Her face was still pale, but her expression was composed. "I see. And what did they say?" "Nothing you probably haven't heard before," he said, his voice cruel, deliberately designed to wound. "Too old, too plain, too common. They wondered what a man like me could possibly see in a woman like you." Each word was a stone, and he hurled them at her, watching them hit their mark. He saw her shoulders hunch slightly, as if against a cold wind. But her voice, when she spoke, remained impossibly steady. "And what did you tell them, Coulter?" "Nothing," he said, and that single, cowardly word carried all the poison and cruelty in his heart. "What could I tell them?" The silence that followed was deafening. It was heavier and more profound than any blizzard. Malin stood motionless for so long that Coulter began to wonder if she'd even heard him. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, stripped of all emotion. "I see," she said. "Well, then I suppose I should pack my things." The words hit him like a bucket of ice water to the face, shocking him out of his angry stupor, washing away the pride and leaving behind pure, gut-wrenching panic. "Malin, wait!" But she was already moving toward the door, her dignity a shield around her. He could see the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but she held them back. "I'll be gone by morning," she said without turning around. Her voice was flat, final. "I'll send word to town for someone to collect me." "Malin, please." He struggled to his feet, his leg protesting the sudden, clumsy movement. "I didn't mean it." "You meant every word," she said quietly, pausing at the threshold to her room. She still wouldn't look at him. "And perhaps you were right to mean them. Perhaps they were all right, too." She disappeared into the hallway, closing her door softly behind her, leaving Coulter utterly alone with the bitter taste of his own cruelty on his tongue. He sank back into his chair, his eyes fixed on the liniment bottle she'd left on the table. The small glass container seemed to mock him, a tiny monument to all the care she'd given him, all the gentle moments they'd shared, all of it thrown away in one ugly, prideful moment. Sleep was impossible that night. He lay in his bed, tangled in the clean sheets that she had washed and pressed to perfection. And he listened. He listened to the soft sounds of her packing in the room down the hall. Each rustle of fabric, each soft thud of a book being placed in a bag, each quiet creak of the floorboards felt like another nail being hammered into the coffin of his own happiness. As the long, dark hours crawled toward dawn, Coulter found himself thinking, Not about the gossips in town, not about his own wounded pride. He thought about Malin. He pictured her small, competent hands changing his bandages with infinite care. He remembered the way she had transformed his house from a bachelor's hovel into a true home. He thought about her quiet, unshakable wisdom, her gentle corrections, her uncanny ability to see straight through to the heart of any problem, including the problems within him. And the realization hit him like a physical blow, like a lightning bolt that lit up the dark, foolish corners of his soul. He didn't care what the town thought. He didn't care that she was older. He didn't care that she was shorter. He didn't care that she was plainer than the empty-headed beauties he had once pursued. What he cared about was the vast, aching emptiness that had opened up in his chest at the thought of losing her. He cared about the way his house would feel like a tomb without her quiet presence. He cared about the way his entire future suddenly looked gray, bleak, and meaningless without her in it. As the first pale, gray light of dawn crept through his windows, he heard it. The soft click of her bedroom door opening, the quiet, final sound of her footsteps moving toward the front of the house. Panic, raw and absolute, gave him a strength he didn't know he possessed. He bolted from his bed, ignoring the sharp protest of his leg, and raced through the house. He caught her just as her hand reached for the cold brass of the door handle. "Don't go," he said. The words were a raw, desperate plea, torn from the very center of his being. She turned. Her eyes were dry, her face composed. Somehow, her calm control hurt him worse than tears would have. "Coulter," she began, but he cut her off. "You've been my cure," he said, the words tumbling out in a frantic, jumbled rush. "My counsel, my quiet fire. You've shown me what real strength looks like, what real beauty is. You've made me a better man just by being in my house, in my life." Her hand tightened on the handle of her bag. "Pretty words don't change the facts, Coulter." "What facts?" he demanded, stepping closer. "The fact that you're not some simpering belle who doesn't have a thought in her head? The fact that you're worth 10 of any woman I ever thought I wanted?" He stepped closer still, close enough to see the tiny flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "The only fact that matters is this one," he said, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. "I don't want to live without you." Her own voice was barely audible. "Coulter, you've turned my world upside down," he continued, his hands coming up to frame her face, to feel the reality of her. "You've shown me that substance matters more than surface, that wisdom trumps youth, that a woman who can heal both bodies and souls is worth more than all the pretty faces in Wyoming put together." A single tear, a traitor to her careful control, finally escaped and rolled down her cheek, landing warm on his thumb. "The town will never accept it," she whispered. "They'll always talk." "Let them talk," he said, his voice fierce with a newfound conviction. "Let them whisper until their tongues fall out. I know what I want now, and I want you. Not the woman they think I should want. Not the woman I used to think I wanted. I want you, Malin, exactly as you are." He pressed his forehead against hers, the world shrinking until it was only the two of them in the cold dawn light. His voice dropped again, full of awe and reverence. "You're my sweet poison, Malin, the kind that doesn't kill a man. It brings him to life." For a long, heart-stopping moment, they stood frozen in the doorway, the entire future balanced on a knife's edge. Then, Malin's worn leather bag dropped from her fingers, thudding softly onto the floor. And she was in his arms, her arms wrapping around his neck, kissing him with all the pent-up emotion of the long, terrible night. A kiss of forgiveness, and hope, and a new beginning. "You're sure?" she whispered against his lips, her breath warm. "I've never been more sure of anything in my entire life," he replied. And he meant it. From the bottom of his newly awakened soul, he meant it. Spring came to Wyoming that year like a benediction. The bitter cold of winter melted away, and the land came alive with a sense of new beginnings. Coulter's leg was fully healed, the slight limp a constant, welcome reminder of the ordeal that had brought Malin into his life. She remained at the ranch, now not as his nurse, but as his partner, at his insistence. Their arrangement was unconventional, and the town still whispered, but Coulter had learned to care more about his own happiness than the town's opinion. The change in him was remarkable. Where once he had been quick to anger and slow to trust, he now approached problems with the careful consideration Malin had taught him. His ranch hands, responding to his newfound respect for their expertise, worked with a renewed enthusiasm. The ranch prospered. Word of Coulter Draven's success and his strange but effective new management style began to spread throughout the territory. It was during a particularly successful cattle drive in April that a man named Marcus Thornfield rode into camp. He was a smooth-talking merchant from Denver, and he approached Coulter with an opportunity that seemed too good to be true. "Mr. Draven," Thornfield said, his silver tongue polished to perfection, "I've heard great things about your success. I think you're exactly the kind of forward-thinking rancher who would appreciate what I'm offering." He opened a leather case, revealing a collection of gleaming saddles, bridles, and tack that caught the sunlight like jewels. "The finest leather goods money can buy," he purred, "straight from the master craftsman of St. Louis. On credit, of course. A man of your standing shouldn't have to pay cash up front." Coulter felt the old, familiar pull of pride and status. The gear was beautiful. Owning it would certainly make a statement to the other ranchers. But as he reached for his wallet, he heard Milan's quiet voice echoing in his memory. A conversation they'd had weeks ago. "A shiny saddle is a peacock's feather, Coulter. It looks impressive, but it's no real investment. Keep your coin for cattle or land. Things that feed you, not things that just glitter." He looked at the glittering tack, then back at Thornfield's oily smile. "It's beautiful work," Coulter said diplomatically, "but I'll have to pass. I'm putting my money into livestock this season." Thornfield's smile never wavered, but Coulter caught the flash of irritation in his eyes. "Surely a man of your success can afford to look the part." "A man of true success knows the difference between looking prosperous and being prosperous," Coulter replied, surprised by his own wisdom. It sounded like something Milan would say. 6 months later, the truth came out. Thornfield had been selling shoddy, inferior goods at premium prices, taking payments on credit, and disappearing before the poor craftsmanship became apparent. Several ranchers in the territory were ruined. Coulter had saved himself. Not just money, but his reputation. That evening, as he and Malin sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, he reflected on how much his life and his way of thinking had changed. "You've made me wiser," he said suddenly. Malin looked up from the mending in her lap. She was repairing one of his shirts with her characteristic, perfect precision. "How so?" "A year ago, I would have bought that flashy gear from Thornfield without a second thought. I would have cared more about impressing people than about building something solid." He paused, studying her profile in the golden light. It was a profile he now knew better than his own. "I sought good looks, but I found good sense. I sought youth, but I found wisdom. I sought charm, but I found loyalty." She set down her sewing, giving him her full, undivided attention. "I spent years," he continued, his voice low and earnest, "chasing after women who turned heads when they walked into a room. Beautiful women, young women, women with all the social graces I thought I wanted. But none of them could see past the surface of things. None of them understood what it truly meant to build something that lasts." "Coulter." "I'm not finished," he said gently. He rose from his chair and moved to kneel on the porch boards beside her. From his pocket, he pulled a small, simple gold ring. It wasn't ornate or flashy, but solid, simple and beautifully crafted. You've been my cure, my counsel, my quiet fire. You've shown me what real love looks like. Not the flashy kind that burns bright and dies fast, but the steady, constant kind that warms a man through the coldest nights of his soul. Malin's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and shining with unshed tears. "Will you be my wife, Malin Dross?" he asked simply. For a long moment she just stared. She looked at the ring, then at his face, as if trying to convince herself that this was real. When she finally spoke, her voice was a fragile whisper. "But I am older, Coulter. I'm shorter. I'm too old to bear children. I am less than what you dreamed of." Coulter reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had started to fall. "You are everything I dreamed of," he said firmly, his voice thick with emotion. "I was just too blind and foolish to see it. You're not too old. You're experienced. You're not too short. You're perfectly sized to fit right here, against my heart. And as for children," he smiled, a genuine, loving smile. "If God blesses us with them, wonderful. If not, then I have all I will ever need right here." He looked her directly in the eyes, willing her to see the truth of his words. "The town will learn to mind their own business. Malin, I don't want to marry you despite what they think. I want to marry you because of who you are, because you make me a better man, because you see the man I could be and you help me become him, because I love you." The words, the most important words of his life, hung in the quiet evening air between them. The first time either of them had spoken them aloud. Malin searched his face, looking for any trace of doubt or reservation. She found only sincerity, devotion, and a deep, abiding determination. "Yes," she whispered. And then, louder, her voice ringing with joy, "Yes, Coulter, I will marry you." He slipped the simple gold ring onto her finger. It fit as perfectly as she fit into his life. They kissed as the sun finally set over the vast Wyoming plains, sealing a promise that would change not just their lives, but the future of the entire territory. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning in the small chapel in Cedar Ridge, exactly 1 year to the day after the accident that had brought them together. The ceremony was simple, attended only by Hoyt and Sarah Draven, the loyal ranch hands, and a handful of curious townspeople who had come to witness the unlikely union for themselves. Malin wore a dress of pale blue silk. Not white, she'd said, as she was too old for such maidenly pretenses, but she looked radiant. Her hair was arranged in a softer style than her usual severe bun, and her plain face glowed with a quiet, profound happiness. Coulter stood beside her in his best suit, his hands steady, his eyes never leaving her face as he slipped a wedding band onto her finger to join the engagement ring. "Do you, Coulter Draven, take Malin Dross to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Coulter said, his voice carrying with strength and clarity through the small church. "Do you, Malin Dross, take Coulter Draven to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Malin replied, her voice steady despite the tears of joy in her eyes. The townspeople murmured amongst themselves, a mixture of shock and fascination, but Coulter only had eyes for his bride. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss was gentle, but it was full of the promise of a lifetime. The biggest surprise, the final twist that silenced the gossips for good, came sooner than anyone expected. Within a month of their wedding, Malin discovered she was with child. It was a development that utterly stunned the town, especially those who had so confidently written her off as too old for motherhood. The pregnancy was healthy and uncomplicated. Malin approached impending motherhood with the same quiet competence and grace she brought to everything else. Their first son was born the following summer. A strong, healthy boy they named James after Malin's blacksmith father. He had his mother's steady temperament and his father's strong build. From the moment he drew his first breath, it was clear he was a remarkable child. 2 years later came their second son, Thomas. He inherited his mother's quick, perceptive mind and her uncanny ability to see to the heart of any problem. Their daughter, Sarah, arrived when Maylin was 42, a development that the doctors in Cheyenne declared a near miracle. The little girl was a perfect blend of both her parents, her mother's practical wisdom tempered by her father's warmth and charm. She grew up to be not conventionally pretty, but striking in her intelligence and character. As the children grew, they became living, breathing proof of their mother's worth. James grew into a respected rancher in his own right, known for his fair dealing and innovative methods. Thomas became a lawyer, using his mother's gift for seeing through deception to build a practice based on integrity and justice. Sarah became a beloved teacher and writer, carrying forward her mother's belief in the power of steady work and quiet wisdom. The Draven Ranch prospered beyond anything Coulter had ever imagined, and Mylan's practical wisdom became the stuff of legend. Spend once, not thrice, became a common saying among cattlemen. Buy cows, not frills, was quoted in newspapers as far away as Denver. Speak soft, not harsh, became the foundation of a new style of ranch management that prioritized respect and loyalty over fear and dominance. Coulter often marveled at how different and how much richer his life had become from what he had once envisioned. The beautiful, young society wife of his youthful dreams seemed like a foolish, empty fantasy now. In Maylin, he had found something far more valuable, a true partner who made him better, wiser, and stronger every single day. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they sat on that same porch where he had proposed, watching their 3 children play in the yard as the sun began to set. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Regret what?" Maylin replied, her hands, as always, busy with the mending that never seemed to end in a household with 3 active children. "Marrying me," he said, "giving up your independence, risking all the talk." Maylin set down her sewing and looked at him. Those same perceptive brown eyes that had seen through his pride and prejudice from the very beginning now held a deep, gentle amusement. "Coulter Draven," she said softly, "you are still the most foolish man I have ever known." "Is that a yes or a no?" he pressed, a smile playing on his lips. She leaned over and kissed him, her lips still soft and warm after all these years. "That's an I love you, you ridiculous man," she whispered, "and I wouldn't change a single day of our life together." As the sun set over the Wyoming plains, painting the sky in the same shades of gold and crimson as it had on the night he proposed, Coulter reflected on the profound truth Maylin had taught him. The sweetest poison was the kind that didn't destroy, but transformed. It was the kind that took a proud, stubborn, foolish man and turned him into someone worthy of love. It was the kind that proved, beyond any doubt, that sometimes the most extraordinary gifts come in the most ordinary packages. And if a man was wise enough or lucky enough to recognize that gift for what it truly was, not poison at all, but medicine for the soul, he might just find himself blessed beyond his wildest dreams. The Draven name became synonymous with integrity, prosperity, and wisdom. And at the center of it all was a woman who had once been dismissed as too old, too plain, and too ordinary to matter. Maylin Draven proved them all wrong. She proved that true worth has nothing to do with age or appearance, and everything to do with character, competence, and the quiet strength that can transform not just one man, but generations to come. Their love story became a legend in the territory, a tale told and retold around countless campfires and dinner tables. The story of a man who learned to see past the surface to the treasures that lay beneath, and of a woman whose value was measured not in beauty or youth, but in the boundless depth of her wisdom and the unwavering steadiness of her love. If you enjoyed this story of a love that defied all expectations, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of the unexpected.